the most favored new god, the most favored new gods, a most favored new god, the most favored new goddess, the most favored new goddesses, a most favored new goddess, the most favored old god, the most favored old gods, a most favored old god, the most favored old goddess, the most favored old goddesses, a most favored old goddess, the most favored greater god, the most favored greater gods, a most favored greater god, the most favored greater goddess, the most favored greater goddesses, a most favored greater goddess, the most favored lesser god, the most favored lesser gods, a most favored lesser god, the most favored lesser goddess, the most favored lesser goddesses, a most favored lesser goddess, the most favored greater spirit, the most favored greater spirits, a most favored greater spirit, the most favored lesser spirit, the most favored lesser spirits, a most favored lesser spirit, the most favored major god, the most favored major gods, a most favored major god, the most favored major goddess, the most favored major goddesses, a most favored major goddess, the most favored minor god, the most favored minor gods, a most favored minor god, the most favored minor goddess, the most favored minor goddesses, a most favored minor goddess, the most favored superior god, the most favored superior gods, a most favored superior god, the most favored superior goddess, the most favored superior goddesses, a most favored superior goddess, the most favored inferior god, the most favored inferior gods, a most favored inferior god, the most favored inferior goddess, the most favored inferior goddesses, a most favored inferior goddess, the most favored ancestor god, the most favored ancestor gods, a most favored ancestor god, the most favored ancestor goddess, the most favored ancestor goddesses, a most favored ancestor goddess, the most favored descendant god, the most favored descendant gods, a most favored descendant god, the most favored descendant goddess, the most favored descendant goddesses, a most favored descendant goddess, the most favored descendant god, the most favored descendant gods, a most favored descendant god, the most favored descendant goddess, the most favored descendant goddesses, a most favored descendant goddess, the most favored transcendent god, the most favored transcendent gods, a most favored transcendent god, the most favored transcendent goddess, the most favored transcendent goddesses, a most favored transcendent goddess, the most favored future god, the most favored future gods, a most favored future god, the most favored future goddess, the most favored future goddesses, a most favored future goddess, the most favored present god, the most favored present gods, a most favored present god, the most favored present goddess, the most favored present goddesses, a most favored present goddess, the most favored past god, the most favored past gods, a most favored past god, the most favored past goddess, the most favored past goddesses, a most favored past goddess, the most favored god, the most favored gods, a most favored god, the most favored goddess, the most favored goddesses, a most favored goddess, the most favored half god, the most favored half gods, a most favored half god, the most favored half goddess, the most favored half goddesses, a most favored half goddess, the most favored vessel, the most favored vessels, a most favored vessel, the most favored person, the most favored persons, a most favored person, the most favored image, the most favored images, a most favored image, the most favored belief, the most favored beliefs, a most favored belief, the most favored thought, the most favored thoughts, a most favored thought, the most favored word, the most favored words, a most favored word, the most favored action, the most favored actions, a most favored action, the most favored situation, the most favored situations, a most favored situation, the most favored circumstance, the most favored circumstances, a most favored circumstance, the most favored relationship, the most favored relationships, a most favored relationship, the most favored number, the most favored numbers, a most favored number, the most favored formula, the most favored formulas, a most favored formula, the most favored symbol, the most favored symbols, a most favored symbol, the most favored color, the most favored colors, a most favored color, the most favored thing, the most favored things, a most favored thing, the most favored way, the most favored ways, a most favored way, the most favored place, the most favored places, a most favored place, the most favored time, the most favored times, a most favored time, the most favored event, the most favored events, a most favored event, the most favored result, the most favored results, a most favored result,